Hey everybody, we're back for a series of videos here on chapter 13. So this is hopefully a little bit shorter of a chapter, shouldn't take us quite as long as the last one. But this chapter is on chapter 13 on positive externalities and public goods. So we just finished talking about negative externalities and pollution and concepts like ecotourism and command and control regulation and different market approaches to regulating pollution and all of those things. Now we're going to kind of look at the opposite side of these positive externalities, things that are generally considered to be good for society and that are produced by markets, sometimes with some public incentives, but they are generally what we consider public goods. So our agenda here, we've got, we're going to do the introduction here. We'll start with that. That's going to lay the groundwork. Then we're going to examine some investments in innovation, which is going to help us understand why innovation is so important and how innovation generates benefits for more than just the innovator. Then we'll discuss how governments can encourage innovation through various policies and initiatives. And then we'll turn our attention to public goods, which we're going to explore their unique characteristics and the challenges they present for market provision. All right, so this is our introduction section. So with these concepts, these two concepts, they're distinct concepts, but they're very closely related concepts. And they're closely related where the free market alone might not deliver the best outcomes for society as a whole. So it's important to understand that the government intervention is sometimes warranted in a market economy. So let's start by just defining these two terms. Positive externalities refer to situations where the benefits of producing or consuming a good or service spills over into third parties who are not directly involved in the transaction. It's the exact opposite of the negative externality. So think of it as a side benefit that accrues to somebody else. Public goods, on the other hand, are goods that are non-excludable and non-rivalrous in nature. We'll talk more about what that means when we get to that section. But basically that means that it's difficult or it's impossible to prevent people from using these public goods, and one person's use doesn't diminish another person's ability to benefit. So these goods tend to benefit society very broadly. And as we delve into these ideas, we're going to be asking some important questions like, how does private innovation generate benefits for society at large? What role should governments play in fostering innovation and managing resources that we all share collectively? So to illustrate the idea of these spillover benefits from innovation, think about the legacy of the Voyager 1 mission. It was launched back in 1977. It was a very ambitious undertaking by NASA, and it involved some sophisticated engineering, with its onboard computer processing around 8,000 instructions per second. Now, that's nothing in today's terms. Today, phones can do 14 billion processes per second, or instructions per second. But the primary goal was to explore our solar system. The technological advancements that were developed for Voyager in order to accomplish that goal had many more far-reaching impacts. And that is generally the case whenever, you have these big, ambitious science projects. It can be also be the case when you're at times of war and you develop something through the Department of Defense that ends up being useful in many other ways. Right? The research and the engineering that's involved in contributing to the development of modern technologies that we use today, like kidney dialysis machines and mammogram equipment and the computers you work off of and the internet, all of this technology is, much of it, not all, but much of it is government-funded innovation that has societal benefits that extend far beyond the initial objectives of the project. The technology developed for space exploration, in the case of Voyager 1, spilled over to improve healthcare and other areas, and it benefited countless people who had no direct contribution or connection to the Voyager program itself. So the Voyager example, it might seem a little bit historical at this point, but let's think about this in terms of present day. Think about the internet. Think about GPS and cell tower networks. voice activation technologies. Many of these originated from government-funded research. And so while these technologies now underpin these massive private industries and countless consumer products, their initial development often relied on public investment. Think about GPS. That's maintained by the US government at an annual cost of around $19 billion. The public infrastructure enables countless private sector innovations like ride-sharing apps. I use one called Strava when I go out for a run that uses GPS technology. I guarantee Strava didn't put a satellite in space. They're using somebody else's. They're getting the benefit from that, or we all are. It's estimated that US businesses could lose about $1 billion daily if GPS didn't exist or it wasn't supported. So it just highlights some of the significant economic impact that these spillover benefits. And it's generally, when we think about innovation in this sense, it can be seen as a public good all by itself. And the new technology that broadly benefits to society, not just the initial innovator, is kind of evidence of that. Now, if innovation provides such widespread benefits, then why don't private firms invest in it even more? That's not to say that they don't, but research and development is expensive, right? So why don't private firms invest in it even more if they're going to see these widespread benefits? And the reality is that private firms have several challenges when it comes to facing large-scale innovation projects. One major hurdle is the high risks and the high costs associated with many of these innovative projects. There's a significant fear of failure and the potential for substantial financial losses. That limits the private sector research and development spending. This is where the government steps in, oftentimes. The government can play that role of funding these high-risk, high-reward research projects that private firms themselves might be a little hesitant to undertake on their own. Additionally, the government can provide the foundation for private firms to then build upon and innovate even further long past the assistance that they've been given. So the development of the GPS by the U.S. Department of Defense is a good example of that, because it's the government propping up the industry to start out, and now it's taken off. It's its own thing. So we talked about innovation having like public good-like characteristics. It could be considered, innovation in and of itself could be considered a public good almost, or a public service, let's say. But now let's focus specifically on these public goods and why they often lead to things like market failures. That may not sound quite right now, but it will here in a second. So as we mentioned earlier, public goods have two key characteristics. They're non-excludable, meaning they're difficult or impossible to prevent people from using the good, even if they don't pay for it. Think about national defense. It's impossible to protect only those who pay their taxes. Think about your public parks. We don't have gatekeepers at the parks. Well, at least not all parks. Your regular old city park won't have a gatekeeper that says you got to pay a toll, you got to pay a fee to get into the park. We don't have that. Now, second, public goods are non-rivalrous, meaning that one person's use of the good does not reduce its availability or its usefulness to other people. For example, everyone in a city can enjoy that public park, and it's not going to diminish the enjoyment from others, at least up to a certain point of, once you get to overcrowding, then it's an issue. But generally speaking, that resource is there, and if it's built to serve that population and all members of that population, then it's non-rivalrous. So it's because of these characteristics, primarily these two characteristics, that private markets often underprovide public goods due to what's known as the free rider problem. The government has this problem as well. We'll talk more about the free rider problem. There's not just this problem either. So the question, though, is why would someone pay for a good if they can benefit from it without paying? Can't they just free ride on what's out there in the public and not have to pay for it? So this is why government intervention is often necessary to help ensure that public goods are available to benefit society. While government funding and support is vital for fostering innovation and providing public goods, it's not without its own set of challenges. Right? When it comes to the government sponsoring innovation, a key challenge here is funding, which comes from from taxpayers, and the implementation piece. So government R&D, like I said, is typically underpinned by taxpayer money, which means there needs to be a careful consideration by policymakers, those who make the budgets, of how much funds are going to be allocated and how the funds are to be allocated across different projects and different sectors, right? These politicians, they're having to serve their own interests, their own constituents, and so they're going to prioritize projects that they think, are best for their constituents, which is going to create a little bit of a dialogue between all these policymakers about what projects should be funded and how much should they be funded by. Furthermore, employment and industry changes kind of complicates a lot of the implementation and the management of these initiatives. There's also a need to balance the risks. Governments can often take on riskier projects that private firms can avoid, which leads to breakthroughs, but also to projects that don't yield the desired results. Just because the government's taking on the risk doesn't make it less risky. It's still just as risky. It may not work out. It might be a waste of your tax dollars, and that tends to piss people off, right? And then you don't get reelected, all these things. So there are challenges, but the potential rewards can also be very significant, including things like driving economic growth, addressing critical societal challenges like climate change and inequality, and just these technological breakthroughs can really have a lot of positive benefits. It's a double-edged sword in some ways. Another area where we see the need for collective action and for potential government involvement is in the case of common resources that can, which can lead to overuse. This is often referred to as the tragedy of the commons. So in one hand, you've got the free rider problem, and the other, you've got the problem of the tragedy of the commons. In this case, resources like marine fisheries, for example, they often get overused because there's a lack of clear ownership and there's very few incentives to conserve. The key problem here is overconsumption and then the depletion of shared resources, and that tends to harm the long-term sustainability of ecosystems, of resources, of everything. So to address this, the governments can play a crucial role by regulating or incentivizing the conservation of common resources. This might involve setting fishing quotas, implementing conservation programs, or establishing property rights where it's feasible to do so. If you ever think about, if you ever want to go fishing in the state of West Virginia, well, you've got to get a fishing license. If you want to go hunting, you got to have a hunting license. You've got to go through and you've got to pay a fee to these agencies. And if you don't have that license, you got to pay a much bigger fee if you're caught, because that is the government stepping in and saying, yes, it's a public waterway and there's fish in there, but we're not going to let just every Tom, Dick, and Harry come through and fish as much as they want to. We've got to set some rules here. Otherwise, there will be no fish left. That's the idea. So as we move forward in this chapter, we're going to be looking deeper at these concepts. We'll explore some questions that arise from this introduction. We'll also consider what motivates private investment in innovation, given the potential for these spillover benefits. We'll look at how governments can effectively encourage research and development technology. And then we'll tackle, which goods are better provided by the government than by the markets. How should we allocate those R&D funds? Which ones are better done on one other than the other? And then finally, we'll discuss some of the crucial challenges that society faces when trying to balance economic growth with the conservation of our shared resources. So these are the central themes here in this chapter. All right, so in the next video, we'll start with the investments in innovation. Hopefully this is an interesting chapter. I'm going to try to get through it a little faster than the last one. So appreciate you guys, and I'll see you on the next one.